Part 1, Chapter 1 of Better Angel by Richard Meeker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Better Angel by Richard Meeker. Part 1, Chapter 1. Kurt Gray was 13 years old, but as he sat in the broad chair, pulled close to the square front window, he seemed still a little boy. Partly it was the light, partly it was the way in which one thin leg was tucked under him, and his chin dug into his fist. Folded together over his book, he seemed smaller than he was. It was early March. Patches of graying snow thatched the earth outside, and a gray sky, tarnished with gold from a sun gone down behind the grove of oaks opposite, gave to the light a pale, cold, honey-colored translucence that was thin and clear and yet liquid and winy. The room was in deep shadow, and the boy, his head bent almost to the pages of the book, strained his eyes over it with such a silent intentness that he seemed grown to the heavy chair and to the dim, aqueous atmosphere of the room. The faint sounds of rattling dishes and his mother's step in the kitchen could not break through into his consciousness. Now Heracles, he read, though his warriors were ready and urging him to be off on the long-awaited quest for the fleece, refused to set sail until Hylas was found. For Hylas, famed among all the youths of the country for his beauty, was the hero's favorite. In spite of the impatient grumblings of the princes and of the warriors, Heracles sought his young friend. Through field and woodland he went calling aloud, "Hylas! Hylas!" But Hylas was nowhere to be found. "Kurt!" It was his mother. He started as she entered the room behind him, thrusting the book between his thigh and the oaken arm of the chair in vain attempt at concealment. "Reading again, and in this light. Don't you know you'll ruin your eyes? If you must read, do put on the light." "I was just—" he began, justifying himself. "Oh, it's all right. Run now and get me a pail of water like a good boy. Your dad will be home for supper before we know it. Hike!" She gave him a good-natured shove as he shuffled through the door, rubbing his eyes. Kurt Gray had reached the age of 13, in a state of unusual seriousness, unusual loneliness, and unusual innocence. He had no brothers or sisters, and his parents were already in middle age. They worshipped him, yet he escaped somehow, being the proverbial spoiled child. A certain pliability which made him popular with the older people he was thrown with, a pliability which was partially a lack of self-assertiveness and partially a shrinking from disagreement, was in reality his greatest fault. This pliability came from his father, a mild, good-humored man who had set out to be a lawyer, and who, because of the same gentleness which prevented his pushing and elbowing his way through the rough-and-tumble competition of the 90s, had ended by becoming a furniture dealer in Barton, Michigan, a town only a few miles from the farm on which he was born. Kurt liked his father, and Elmer Gray had for his son the sort of devotion that borders on the religious, since it contains an admixture of fear. Not that he was afraid of Kurt, it was not that, but there was, even when the boy was very young, an unaccountable feeling on the part of the father that in this small body and brain there was a latent superiority, a tenuous spirituality of some sort which he could never have analyzed or understood, but which, when the two were alone together, as they were so infrequently, made the man slightly reticent, slightly and inexplicably fearful that he would not please the boy, and his son would be ashamed of him. It was a feeling Kurt certainly did not share, consciously at least, but it created between them a wall not to be penetrated. From his mother Kurt got, in multiplied measure, the love of beauty and the sensitiveness that set him apart from his companions, so apart that sometimes he wished himself violently otherwise. Mrs. Gray loved her son better than anything else in life. She had been married 10 years when he was born. He came at a time when life in the little town was beginning to set her on edge. She had never fitted in very well. There was something of the aristocrat in her that made the women of the town regard her enviously as a snob, or defensively as a truly superior being. She had come to Barton with her husband after 2 years of married life. She had been something of a beauty, slender, with blue eyes, pale brown hair, soft and fine, and a clear, cool skin. She had never had much of an education, but her mind was alert and objective, the sort of mind that was quick to see the shallowness and dullness of the life about her, and although it had never known anything much brighter or deeper, to be contemptuous of it. She had had her dreams. As a girl, her passion for color and the feel of things, coupled with a modest talent, had led her to drawing. She had sketched, she had done a few promising watercolors, she had longed vaguely to improve herself, but not known how. The people in the town where she lived thought her talented and flighty. Flighty particularly when she had proposed going off alone to Boston to study art. Her father was not rich, a harness maker with his own shop and 3 other daughters to support, so she had not gone. She had put away her dreams with her brushes. She had married Elmer Gray because she loved him. She had seen that he was good and kind. She was now seeing that he was ineffectual, and she was beginning to envision herself doomed to the drab life that her neighbors lived. She saw life stretching ahead of her like a gray and barren prairie, with the rebelliousness that, kept so vigorously in check, made her unhappy and discontent. Her unquestioned leadership in the meager social life of Barton appeared to her a petty and unsatisfactory compromise. Then Kurt had come, and she knew that in him, if ever, her dreams must flower and bear fruit. So she had been glad that he was nice-looking. She had been glad that his eyes were brown, like Elmer's, that his hair was soft like her own, that his skin was smooth and white, that he was straight and without blemish. She had nursed him jealously through illnesses, when her lips constricted with fright for the fragility of his little life. She had seen to it that he was well-mannered, clean, that he knew his letters and his Bible stories, and that he went to school as soon as he was old enough. And how proud she had been when he did the work of 2 grades in 1 year, and when he brought home his monthly report cards with the high grades that seemed to give him so little trouble. She was not unequivocally pleased with him, however. As he grew older, as he started going to school, she noticed in him more and more the pliability that she felt was her husband's greatest stumbling block. It frightened her. Was her dream, that promised so richly, to be frustrated by the softness that Kurt displayed? It frightened her because she did not know how to combat it. She had never known how, in Elmer's case. To him she had talked until she realized it did no good, urging him to be less lenient, to be more belligerent in his business dealings. She had wheedled, she had scolded, she had even at times dared to be flamingly contemptuous, and had invariably regretted it when she saw how it hurt him. So, when Kurt would come home, as he too often did, white-faced and trembling, to stand silently by the big front window, looking off to the river and the ragged line of oaks over which the stacks of the paper mills rose, when she would put her arms around his narrow shoulders, when she would kiss his cheek and he would shake her off, ashamed that she should see his racking bitterness, when at last, hesitantly, perhaps in a flood of tears, he would admit that the boys at school had teased him about his fair skin. "Where'd you buy your paint, sissy? Sissy, sissy." When, with body shaking and hands clenched, eyes strangely dark in his white face, he would sob, "Why, Mom? Why can't they leave me alone?" When she would see him starting nervously to school a full half-hour early to avoid the boys congregating around the door, she was worried and frightened. She and Elmer talked it over together. They tried in every way they knew to interest him in things other boys of his age liked. They bought him a cowboy suit, a football, baseball mitts, boxing gloves. He was always grateful, but never enthusiastic. He would start bravely out with his new possession, becoming, for a splendid moment, the hero of the neighborhood boys, because his football, or his catcher's mitt, would be the best that Elmer Gray could buy. He would play for a while, a little clumsily always, it seemed to his mother, a little afraid that some awkwardness of his would bring down upon him the terrible barbaric scorn of his playmates. and soon he would be out of the game, his ball flying goldenly up and down the playground, and he, more than likely, headed for the big chair in the front window with a storybook. It always ended so. The closet of his bedroom became a storehouse of little-used sporting things, which would lie there until his parents sadly agreed that Kurt doesn't seem much to care for it, and the ball or the gloves or the racket would be given away. Kurt's father never attempted to talk to the boy about it. He gave ball bats and skates unquestioningly, eagerly even, as gifts which at Kurt's age would have delighted him beyond measure, and he was puzzled and hurt when they had to be given to other boys. Why should his son be different? Why, he was like a girl. But his contempt, if it ever deserved so strong a name, never found expression. When his wife would appeal to him to talk to Kurt, he would always put her off. "Oh, I can't talk to him, Abby. You can do it better. He's more like you somehow." And Abby Gray knew that he was right. But she knew, too, that he was like Elmer in the very particular that most endangered the fulfillment of her dream. In the boy it was taking a different form, that was all. So she had talked. "Why didn't you stand up to him?" she asked one winter day when he had come home pale and silent, trying vainly to hide the fact that he had been running. Kurt was silent for a time, ashamed, but at last came the familiar details. "Why didn't you stand up to him?" she asked. "You're nearly as big as he is. He's just a bully and a coward. If you'd show him, just once, that you weren't afraid of him, he'd leave you alone." And to herself she thought, "What little animals boys can be." You mean I ought to have fought him?" Kurt's tone was incredulous. "Yes, Kurt, even that if you have to stand up for your rights." And he had walked away, pressed his nose against the pane of the window, and stood until the steam of his breath against the cold pallor of the winter afternoon made a halo around his brown head. And she sighed, knowing she had not succeeded. She tried that particular method of procedure times innumerable, realizing painfully on each occasion its inadequacy, its utter uselessness. Her urging had no effect. Then, gradually, almost without her realizing it, a new note was heard in these little conferences, a note that was to become more and more insistent, until it dominated her son in a way which was quite beyond her comprehension, and which, could she have foreseen it, she would have feared as much and shunned as fiercely as the existing softness she sought to destroy. It was the anarchic note of pride in difference. Perhaps she felt in her quickly sympathetic way that, it being impossible to change him, to make him more like his fellows, a thing she desired only for his own happiness, only to the extent that life might be for him less painful, she might at least instill in him a sense of superiority to his persecutors. Most of all, she wanted to comfort him, for she knew that he suffered bravely, for his silence in her presence at these crucial times was the silence of shame that she, his mother, should see his weakness. How many times his concealment was successful, she could not know. "Why do you mind so, Kurt?" she asked him one day. "Those boys are—" and she shrugged her slim shoulders in a way Kurt adored. "What do they amount to, anyway? You can do lots of things they can't. You're smarter. How should she say it? You're different. Be different. Be a leader. If they see that you don't care, they'll quit bothering you. Laugh at 'em. I'd fix 'em." And with dancing eyes she strutted across the room like a triumphant bantam. He had to laugh then. "Oh, Mom," was all he said. But she thought she saw in his eyes a look that she had not seen before, and the look gave her courage. She hoped she had found the means of combating what she feared. There was no instantaneous change, she soon found. Kurt still continued to spend miserable minutes with his schoolmates, and miserable hours of mental anguish when he was alone. The stark and secret suffering of children, stark because the fund of experience and knowledge to combat it, to buoy them up and finally to console them, is so scant, and secret because shame has poisoned them too soon. The unintentioned cruelty of adult laughter, with which parents so often intensify the child's suffering, Kurt did not have to endure. Though he still suffered passionately, this new idea, the idea of pride in difference, seemed to offer him some consolation, however slight, and his mother played upon it at every opportunity. There was in his life one other overpowering fear, the fear of the dark. It was quite as terrible as the other, but since it came less frequently, and since, when he was very young, he had learned that his father was scornfully intolerant of it, he managed to keep it almost entirely to himself. The fear took a peculiar form. It was not a fear of the unseen, of ghosts, of possible hidden presences in the dark. It was fear of blindness. When he was perhaps 8 years old, he had read a story in a collection of mystery tales his father had got from the library that grooved itself into his mind. It was the story of a surgeon who revenged himself on an enemy by pretending to blind him during an operation, and for a day and a night, by keeping his victim's chamber in utter darkness, had kept up the deceit with diabolical cleverness. The agony of the victim, the horror of the deed, the atmosphere of terror that sheathed it, had insinuated themselves into Kurt's brain more thoroughly than he knew. His bedroom was ordinarily fairly light at night. The Greys' house, a large frame affair which they had proudly built in the late 90s when Elmer first came to Barton, stood next but one to the corner, and Kurt's room, which projected out over the circular front porch, had 2 large windows facing on the street, so the arc light from the corner came flickering, pale violet, through the curtains, patterning the wall at the foot of his bed with luminous traceries. In the winter, when the snow covered the ground in the projecting rim of the porch roof, his room was flooded with a dim, purpled grayness. As the buds on the soft maple in the corner began to swell and burst in the spring, and as the thick leaves came forth, the room grew darker. But even in mid-July, the leafy twinklings, though less diffused, still made a welcome light before his eyes. And so long as there was the slightest gleam of light for his eyes to fasten on, he was not afraid. But nights would come, now and then, when the light on the corner would be out. It was a nightly courtesy of Kurt's, as soon as supper was over, to run to the front porch and bring in the evening paper for his father. If he saw that night had fallen and the light was out, his whole evening would be clouded by nervous dread. His parents would read the papers, his father would drowse in his chair, his mother would take up a basket of mending, while he, trying to absorb himself in a book, would punctuate his reading with restless trips to the front window to see whether the light might have come on. He would try, on such occasions, to postpone bedtime by a game of checkers with his father, or by coaxing his mother to read a story. When the time inevitably came, he would linger over his good nights, and at last crawl reluctantly into bed, while darkness rolled in upon him in terrifying waves. Wide-eyed, he would stare at the opaqueness that should be the window, and not until he could detect some faint glow of star, or some doubtful suggestion of darkness not quite complete, would he dare to shut his eyes. Even then he would open them again and again to make sure that the teasing half-dark was still visible, until the intervals became longer, and at last he would fall asleep. His greatest fear was that sometime he would awaken and find only impenetrable blackness. When he was 9 years old, soon after the closing of school in June, he was invited with his parents to spend a weekend at a cottage which some friends had bought at a nearby lake. It was on the first night of his visit that the thing he had always dreaded and yet expected happened. The grown-ups occupied the 2 bedrooms upstairs, and Kurt, to his delight, was settled in the living room on the sofa. Although the night was quite warm, there had been a fire in the grate, and as the shuffling feet upstairs were silenced, and as the yellow oblong of light where the wooden stairs went slanting through the ceiling flashed once or twice and disappeared, it was very pleasant to lie there on his side, watching the fire ribbons dance and waver and send long shadows, seeking, finding, receding, across the painted floor and up the red log walls. There were such things to be seen in a fire: glowing cones of orange red, with licking tongues of lavender, and brass running greedily about them. He fell asleep while the fire danced and the shadows chased across the bed. He awoke, suddenly, dazedly, into such a blackness as he had never imagined. It seemed to have density and weight, to be pressing in upon him. He sat up, stifling a frightened cry. Rigid, he remained there, held in the vice of his fright, staring into it and confronted by nothing, not a gleam, not a spark. The fire had gone out, leaving no ember. The window, where was the window? He leaned over, peering, his arms stretching towards it, his fingers clutching, his whole body yearning towards the light that was not there. He could not see the window, though he felt the pain beneath his fingers. Outside there was the faint hushing murmur of pine branches, and the soft slap of water against the wooden rowboat drawn up to the shore. But no light. Nervously he threw back the covers and felt his way around the foot of the couch. He pressed his face once more against the cold pane, but he could see nothing. Was he really blind? Was all light swallowed up forever? He felt along the wall, slowly, slowly, until quite by chance his groping fingers came upon the button of the electric light. He turned it with happy expectancy. There was the familiar click, but the room remained as dark as before. He moaned a little then. Was he really blind? Was light there, yellow in that small bulb somewhere in the midst of this void, and he unable to see it? The idea sent him, frozen with fear, stumbling back to his bed. It seemed a long way. It was as if some sinister thing had pushed the walls of the room away to an infinite distance, and had poured into the space all the darkness of the world. How long he sat there, shivering and afraid, he did not know. But finally, hours and hours later, it seemed, the window square began to gleam faintly, almost imperceptibly. It became more and more clearly visible, and soon he could see the sweeping branch of the dark cypress outside. He was not blind. Something must have happened to the lights. He was cold and tired. When he next awoke, his mother was pinching his ear, and sunshine was warm upon his face. Later in the same summer, he spent a month at a popular resort on Lake Michigan with his mother and an aunt from Chicago, who had taken a cottage there for the season. His worry about sleeping in a strange place, where the frightening experience of June might be repeated, was soon dissipated, for his room at the beach was as light as the one at home. The days he reveled in. The dunes rose steeply at the back of the cottage with their endless waves of white sand. The paths twisted and climbed through the stunted, sprawling pines, half buried in sand. Pines that could be climbed, and that gave view far out over the glittering blue lake, and that, if you sort of squinted your eyes, became very like the crow's nest of a sailing ship, such as the one Jim Hawkins had sailed on. He could imagine his tormentors in gay pirate costumes, but none so gay as his, toppling one after the other into the sea after some particularly deadly encounter with his trusty blade. By himself he was contented all day. If they would only leave him alone, it could be the same at home. How he hated going back there and entering a new grade in school, with new boys to leer at him, to press him into corners, to finger him with dirty, boy-smelling hands, and to taunt him with his powder face and his inoffensiveness. He had acquired at the beach several brown middy blouses such as city children were wearing, and they became him exceedingly. He liked them, as he instinctively liked nice things. But when, on the return to Barton, his mother demanded that they be worn to school, he protested stormily. Nobody wears 'em. Girls wear white ones, but none of the boys wear 'em. They'll laugh at me. I won't do it." "Oh, yes, you will, dear. They're very nice. You know you like them yourself. Why, I couldn't get you to wear anything else at the Haven. And what else matters? Be different. Be a leader. If you wear them, the other boys will all want them. See if they don't. Start a style. Kurt knew they wouldn't, but he could do nothing but yield, foreboding in his heart, to this absurd adult logic. And the result was quite as he expected. But Mrs. Gray this time would not give in, and the middies were worn, and the shame endured. It was the same again and again. His mother constantly combated Kurt's fear of doing anything that would bring down upon him the ridicule of the schoolboys, with her newly acquired and somewhat roughly formulated philosophy of individuality. "Why do you want to be like the other boys, Kurt?" she would ask. "Everybody who amounts to anything is different. What about all these generals and great men you read about in school? Were they just like everyone else? You don't like the boys that tease you, do you? So why should you want to be like them? Would you like to be like Red Odell?" Red Odell, a beastly little bully, some 2 years Kurt's senior, had, she knew, taken a particularly inquisitorial delight in leading and directing his persecution. Kurt wished she wouldn't harp on it so, but he answered as she expected him to. Red had said things and done things that he would tell no one, things which, aside from the shame they inflicted, he felt to be nasty and repulsive. Those men, were they different, like me, when they were little too? The question surprised her. She was ignorant of Shelley's painful years of public school life, and of other parallels which a wider knowledge might have rallied to support her thesis. But she fabricated cheerfully. "Why, yes, I suppose they were. If they hadn't been, how could they be so fine after they grew up? If a man didn't have something fine and great in him when he was small, could he have it when he got big, Kurt? Don't you think you'd have liked David when he was a boy, or King Arthur, or Lincoln, better than Red Odell? Don't you think I would have liked them better for my boys than Red, just as I like you better? You will make a big man too some day." Kurt was quite sure he would have liked anyone better than Red, but he wasn't so certain that he would have liked Lincoln or King Arthur or David so very much. There was only one boy anyway that he really liked, the boy who lived next door. He was a few months older than Kurt, and 1 grade farther advanced in school. A slow, thoughtful boy, with a passion for making things and a tolerant disposition. He alone never laughed at Kurt. Often, indeed, he silenced the taunts of Kurt's tormentors with a blunt, "Aw, shut up, you! Leave him alone! He don't hurt you, does he? Why don't you pick on somebody your size?" Nob, where he had acquired the nickname, no one seemed to know. His real name was Arthur Bronson, never wanted thanks. He simply and quietly, when it seemed necessary, assumed a sort of guardianship over Kurt, which Kurt appreciated, and his mother as well, for she soon noticed that when Nob was about, Kurt was seldom molested. Playmates of his own age, beside Nob, were very few. There were a number of younger children in the neighborhood, all of whom adored Kurt. He was always willing to play with them, since they never laughed at him. With them he was always happy. His imagination was keen. He had read all the books he could find to read, particularly if they had in them an element of the miraculous. His copy of Grimm's fairy tales was so worn that it became at last a thick, unsightly bundle of dog-eared pages. But Kurt didn't mind, for if the story was broken off by a missing page or a torn cover, he knew how it ended anyway. His greatest delight, when he had a few of the younger children about him, was to enact a play, something he had read or something of his own invention. The plays were always romantic, as fairy tales are romantic, for Kurt loved to pretend being a prince, or, still better, a princess, for as prince or princess he could exercise, in an imaginative way, the suave and silken superiority that was so completely submerged in the everyday routine of life. The performances usually took place in the large upper floor of the barn behind the Bronson house. The barn was of the sort that preceded the garage in small towns throughout the Middle West. A fairly large rectangular building with a sliding door in front, which gave access to a room large enough to house a buggy and a small spring wagon. Behind this was the stable, and overhead, in the loft, a storage place for hay and bedding for the horse. Mr. Bronson, who was foreman of Barton's small furniture factory, though not a well-to-do man, was led by his absorbing bent for things mechanical to purchase the first automobile that was owned in Barton. The buggy, the old horse, the feed, the harness, all that pertained to the outmoded locomotion of the Bronson family, were sold. The stables were turned into a workshop, always redolent of fresh shavings and turpentine, for Bronson was eternally making something or helping his son to learn the tools. And the large loft was left empty, save for a few discarded pieces of furniture and boxes of cast-off clothes. There was a stained, cobweb-festooned window at the south end, and at the north, the front of the barn, a large square door, through which the hay was formerly hoisted. The place made, so Kurt thought, an ideal theatre, and no one seemed to mind. Nob took slight interest in it as a theatre, though as a fortress he had punctured the sides at intervals with a series of loopholes, and had converted the hay chute into a secret passage with a trapdoor at the top, nonchalantly concealed by a much frayed chenille rug. But, fortress or theatre, the two seldom conflicted, and if the circumstance ever arose that an invading army attacked Fort Bronson, as Nob modestly named it, they might remain in complete ignorance of the fact that they were interrupting a performance of that distinguished romantic actor, Kurt Gray, in the title role of Cinderella. For Kurt Gray and his entire company could be quickly, if not very quietly, spirited down the secret passage known only to them and to the intrepid General Bronson, and out through Shay's backyard to the side street. This arrangement pleased Kurt tremendously, for it permitted a shudderingly dramatic exit even when the play was ruined, and it pleased the General because his reputation as a man of sturdy and unwomanish tastes, a perfect Miles Standish of a man, remained uncontaminated. For the most part, however, Kurt's time when he was not in school was spent with a book, at the piano, picking out tunes and pieces his teacher knew nothing about, or with make-believe games in which toy towns and cut-out dolls, always with voluminous wardrobes, and miniature theatres held prominent places. His parents read little, save the daily papers and the few magazines that were always on the living-room table. Their library was small and nondescript. A few padded volumes of Tennyson and Longfellow and Will Carleton, a set of Marie Corelli, and odds and ends from no one knew where. They were glad to see that Kurt enjoyed books, and books they bought. But their buying was indiscriminate. Boys' books galore there were, for Mr. Gray favored these especially as being in some measure a substitute for the boy life his son evaded so carefully. Fairy stories, which Kurt liked best, and such fantasies as the Oz books, which found their way at Christmas time to the village drugstore. Kurt read them all, and read them again, and could not be persuaded to part with them. Baseball bats and boxing gloves he saw pass into the possession of other boys with complete indifference, but his books he treasured with a zeal that was almost miserly. He had all the algebra books that were procurable, and liked them, but his favorites among the cheaply printed, gloomily bound boys' books in his strange library were those in which the element of the unusual entered most strongly: trips to the moon, balloon flights over uncharted seas, explorations up unknown rivers, searches for hidden treasure and lost glories. These, and the fairy tales, which he never forsook, held the greatest fascination for him. Occasionally, when the members of the theatrical troupe of Fort Bronson were kept indoors by unsympathetic mothers, or scattered afield with shocking indifference to the demands of their art, when books palled a bit, and when playing the piano had become, by necessity, a boring matter of scales and finger exercises, Kurt took refuge in his father's store. Often after school, he would hurry home to leave his books, and from there hasten down the wide maple-shaded street, past squat wooden houses, and low narrow porches and spacious green yards, to Main Street, which was even wider, and was bordered on either side for 2 blocks by 2- and 3-story buildings of brick and cement blocks, with here and there a low frame building of an earlier date. Kurt's father owned the store next to the central corner. It was of red brick and 2 stories high. Through the display windows at the front, with their slick gold letters, Elmer Gray, Furniture, the store, which was rather narrow, could be seen stretching back for a considerable distance. The entrance door was in the center, and from it a linoleum-covered aisle led back to a small latticed office between a heterogeneous assortment of golden oak furniture, squatty buffets with shining narrow mirrors, round dining tables with heavy pedestals, mission library tables, uncomfortable fat-looking chairs covered with stiff brown leather, and a glittering display of brass beds at the very end. At one side, a narrow stairway led up to the second floor, skirting a high wall. Its brown oatmeal paper was nearly concealed beneath framed pictures, brown prints of the Angelus, Hope, Sir Galahad, and the Age of Innocence, with here and there a hard flash of color in a varnished sunset, an ink-frozen waterfall, or a dish of waxy and unpalatable-looking fruit. Upstairs, there was a long room overlooking the street where rugs and linoleum were displayed. Some rugs were on the floor in a thick telescopic pile, with edges of blue and red and green and brown. Others, the nicer ones, hung from great sticks that could be swung, fan-like, to display their colors and texture. Most of the chairs were upstairs, too, and many wooden beds. In one of the dim corners at the back, where the light came uncertainly in, through cracked and faded green window shades tacked over the 2 dust-covered windows, were piled the mattresses. It was here Kurt loved to go. Few customers came in, and upstairs he was nearly always alone. Splendid games of house and theater could be played. The swinging rugs made scenery enough, and a disused portiere made a very satisfactory costume. Then, after a play, or a romping pantomime on the cushiony pile of rugs, it was pleasantest of all to climb to the top of the pile of mattresses, to creep far back into the corner, and to pretend of hiding in an inaccessible cave, or just to lie still and not pretend at all. Sometimes the basement would attract him. Here, in front of 2 small dirty windows which pierced through to the sidewalk above, was the long bench where Jeff, the man who helped his father in the store, did his picture framing, made price tags and signs. The little pots of colored ink, the brushes, the small drawers full of slender silver nails, the tools, the miter box, the rack of picture frame molding, bending in its rack at either end, with its own golden weight, furnished him with many hours of amusement. His life became more and more a life lived alone, a life which was turned in upon itself for sustenance and solace. Mrs. Gray was regretful, but she could see no remedy, and so it went on. His schoolwork, except arithmetic, which he despised, was easy for him, and with his father's help even the problems of 7th and 8th grade arithmetic, those ridiculous metaphysical speculations so concerned with improbable objects in improbable combinations, were satisfactorily solved. He liked the schoolroom because there he was free from the fear of taunts. He could expand, for there his superiority was unquestioned. He never seemed to spend much time on his lessons, yet his recitations were always satisfactory. His teachers liked him because he caused them so little trouble, and because there was in his attitude a hint of respect, natural and unconscious on his part, and gratifying to them. He ordinarily liked his teachers. He had no reason to dislike them. The difficulty of the playground was by no means solved. It seemed less grave to his parents, not because it was in reality so, but because, as he grew older, Kurt became more proficient in concealing from them the ignominious position he occupied in the eyes of the boys. He would not fight them. The only alternative was to be as stoical as he could, always for him a difficult task, and to hide as well as he was able the bitterness and shame he felt. His mother's counsel he had adopted as fully as he knew how. There was no use in bothering her now. She had done, he felt, all she could do. There was always the danger that she might go to the teacher, to the superintendent, or to some neighbor for satisfaction of some sort, and that would be intolerable. No, it was better to endure the taunts, though every one of them made him cringe, and make believe it didn't matter. He hated Red Odell with a cold malignancy that would have amazed any of those who knew him as a quiet, studious, and well-mannered boy. When a scourge of diphtheria killed Red during the winter of Kurt's last year in grammar school, he was glad. He knew it was wrong. His mother would have said so. Norton, his Sunday school teacher, would have said so, but would have talked about forgiving one's enemies. But he couldn't help it. He was glad, but no one knew. His life, the life that really mattered in his growth and development, became a secret one. And although at times he uncomfortably felt that this secrecy was untruthful and wicked, it was inevitable. End of Part 1, Chapter 1.